I often see people compare War Thunder to DCS for various reasons, whether it be gameplay or the way weapons or aircraft are modeled in DCS. Some people love to constantly bring it up. However, this is just a bad idea to compare them in general. While on the surface they may seem similar, outside of both being games where you can fly planes and shoot missiles at each other, they're pretty different. They both have different playstyles and for the most part attract different audiences. Those who play War Thunder like the easier to learn controls, and those who play DCS like the more in-depth controls that take more time to learn and to master. There's nothing wrong with either group, but trying to compare the two, even in terms of realism, just doesn't work. Again, in War Thunder, when it comes to controls, I can easily switch planes and still use the same controls and not have to learn everything from the ground up like you have to do in DCS for the most part. War Thunder is also just more accessible and easier to get into for most people. DCS does have greater visual appeal and high quality models are great, however compared to War Thunder it just isn't a perfect simulator that everyone thinks it is. Don't get me wrong, DCS can be tons of fun, but it is by no means perfect. The biggest aspect when comparing the two, people like to bring up the weapon systems in DCS and how they perform. Using DCS as a metric for comparison is just an overall bad idea, as many of its weapons and other aspects are just straight up modeled wrong. One of the bigger issues is the inconsistency in DCS. While in War Thunder, if there's any issues or inaccuracies, they're across the board. But since with DCS, different companies model different planes, they're all modeled in different ways and have different inaccuracies. This can create large inconsistencies in the way flight models or weapon systems work. On the top of this, bugs in DCS take longer to be fixed. Even game-breaking bugs can take a long time to fix, if at all. Also, if you guys could hit those like and subscribe buttons real quick, it would be super helpful. My goal is to hit 500 subs by the end of next month, and it's looking like I'm real close to doing that. So, thank you to anyone who does subscribe. In terms of weapons being modeled in DCS compared to War Thunder, the flare rejection or IRCCM is just not modeled whatsoever in DCS. While War Thunder models the different types of IRCCM, in DCS it is literally just RNG. For each missile in DCS, there's a set chance that it will go for flares or not. This means that despite flaring properly, the missile still may hit you even when it shouldn't. Again, this also does mean that you could just dump flares and the missile could as easily go for them, as there's not much of a point to evade it otherwise. Outside of trying to kinematically defeat it, but for short-range missiles that just doesn't matter. Despite the fact that there isn't a true IRCCM model for DCS, many missiles are just much easier to flare than they should be, though of course that is down to how chance works. In War Thunder, you're able to properly flare the missile as its IRCCM is actually modeled instead of just being a random number deciding what your missile does after every flare. Chaff affects radar missiles similarly in DCS that flares do to IR missiles. You can just dump chaff in order to evade the missile instead of needing to notch and chaff like you should. This is modeled correctly in War Thunder as you can drop all the chaff you want, but if you aren't also notching as well, it won't do anything. DCS also does not model multipathing on everything consistently or correctly. This isn't necessarily a knock at DCS, however it just goes to show that comparing weaponry in War Thunder to it isn't a good idea. The radar models in DCS can also greatly vary in their accuracy. Especially some of the radars on the older planes made by Eagle Dynamics themselves, the model is pretty bad. The exact same goes with flight models. Some are really good, yet others are pretty bad in comparison. The overall comparison on these aspects is a bad idea, as you can't just use another game like DCS as a reference to real life, as it already has its own issues. Also, the consistency of what is accurate or not remains the same across the board, as Gaijin is doing most of the work themselves outside of some of the physical models. Outside of the issues of DCS being inconsistent or inaccurate, like I'd already mentioned, they're both games and fundamentally they're different at the core. On the surface, they may seem similar as they both have aerial combat, but the specific type of player generally varies a lot. Despite the inaccuracies within DCS, it is a lot more immersive and visually appealing than War Thunder. It gives you the ability to interact fully with many aircraft and get very deep into each one of them, which, if you like, is absolutely amazing. However, for War Thunder, it allows for much more easy access and more arcadey controls while still being fairly accurate and having weapon systems modeled correctly for the most part. You're also able to apply the same controls across every plane so that you don't need to relearn everything if you want to switch planes. Also, the benefit of this is that there's hundreds of more planes in War Thunder than in DCS, which gives you so many more choices. The overall gameplay in War Thunder is quite different from DCS, in that for War Thunder you have quicker battles that are easier to get into, and even in simulator or enduring confrontation battles, they're still quicker and much more action-packed than in DCS, where DCS is usually a bit slower and more methodical. It should also be taken into account that War Thunder has no real competitor. Since DCS and World of Warplanes are so different from War Thunder, DCS is more on the simulator side and World of Warplanes is on the arcade side, War Thunder is in the middle with its really own class. I highly doubt there'll be another game similar to War Thunder, or at least one that can compete since Gaijin's so far ahead. Overall, you have to remember that DCS is a game just like War Thunder. It isn't perfect and it can be wrong, but it's also a different gameplay loop and aimed at a different audience. You can't truly compare the two in any way really. Saying one game does one thing different or has something that the other doesn't really doesn't mean anything. It's a bad comparison, and you need to take War Thunder at face value, in that it's in its own class like I'd already mentioned, and it needs to be treated as such. If you guys like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already.